you who've traveled long distances to be here. So looking forward to the day, and thank you all for being here.
Morning, everybody. Let's see. All right. I'm thrilled to see you all here. My name is Jennifer Hirsch, and I am the Senior Director of SCORE and one of the hosts today. And it's so great to have everybody join us for this full day, and very grateful to all of you too who came in from out of town. Raise your hand if you're from out of town. Well, we welcome you here today. Thank you for joining us. We are the hosts, as Julia just introduced, and we want to thank our sponsor also, the Southern States Energy Board, who is the prime in our Southeast Direct Air Capture Hub, which is one of the reasons that we decided to focus on DAC for this particular symposium. My job right now is to go through a couple notes for you on the agenda, to give you a sense of what you are doing. And you all do have a copy of the agenda on your tables, and also you can access it on the link tree, and there's a link to that in the copy of the agenda on your tables. So this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to have a morning that's a combination of some storytelling and then a fantastic keynote talk by Dr. Simone Stewart and a technology response by Dr. Matthew Rell from Georgia Tech. We'll have a little break, and then we'll have a keynote panel with a bunch of amazing community leaders from the Atlanta area who are also our SCORE advisors. Then we'll have a really yummy, very Southern lunch. And then we'll try to keep you awake during the facilitated conversation. Which is the morning panel will be a focus from the Southeast, a regional perspective, and the afternoon one will bring together some of our national leaders with one of our regional leaders to provide a more national perspective on these issues today. And they have both the panels have an interesting charge, which is to listen really well to what happens beforehand and then engage in conversation about what happened beforehand. So there's been only a tiny bit of prep for it, and a lot of it is helping us reflect on what's happening today and giving us more food for thought for later in the day, which will bring us to our group reflection in the afternoon. We'll all engage in crowdsourcing key takeaways, which will help us write that report later on. We'll have some keynote listener remarks from Katrina Pielli from Department of Energy. And if you don't know what a keynote listener is, it's a cool takeaway from today. It's something that we use a lot in community activities. And what it means is you have to listen really well all day, and then you have to reflect back later in the day on what you've heard. So Katrina also is going to be in listening mode and didn't have a lot of prep she could do ahead of time. Then we'll do some networking, and we have a community catered snack bar. We're trying to build up a community catering program in SCORE and do our best to funnel all those food budget from Georgia Tech to community caterers when possible, and then we'll conclude. So that is what the day will look like. A few tips for making the most of your day. We are not going to do bios. Raise your hand if you love to hear bios. That's so good, because we're not going to do them. You have links to bios on the link tree on the agenda, and you can read about everybody. So we'll just do quick introductions. Do access the link tree if you want to see any of these materials. There are exits over here and back here if you need them. There are 2 bathrooms on either side of us, so you can use the bathrooms. If you need a stretch or you need to take a break and we don't have a break at that time, feel free anytime to go out and take a break. We also have a lot of food. We usually have extras, so we also have takeout containers. You are welcome to, at the end, take food for yourself. And then we're going to look a little bit right now at these guidelines. So some of you might have read the guidelines that we sent out ahead of time. They are on your table in the acrylic frame in the middle, so you will be able to take a look at them. And they include our objectives for this day in the planning. They also include assumptions that went into this planning. You don't have to agree with all the assumptions, but those of us who planned it agree with the assumptions. And so we wanted to be transparent about what they are. And then they include guidelines for participation. Raise your hand if you've been involved in kind of group agreements before. A bunch of you have. So we're not going to do a group agreement because we may not all agree. But we have set out these guidelines and we hope you will just trust us and follow them. So what I'd like to have you do for a second is you all have a Post-it in front of you. So if you would indulge me, take a look at these guidelines. They're also on the table. And take about 30 seconds to yourself and identify one of these guidelines that is hard for you. I tend to not be very mindful of my airtime. I talk a lot. It's in my DNA. I'm Jewish. I can't help myself. Somebody told me once that they read that if you're Jewish and you don't interrupt, that's considered rude. So I could do the airtime and the interrupt ones. Those are both challenging to me. But I want you to identify one of these that is challenging for you and write it down on that piece of paper. So do that, and then we'll come back. Chris, can you time me for 30 seconds, please? Okay. So you're identifying one that's hard for you that you can commit to trying to do today. You may. If you want to be an overachiever, you can write down more than one. Okay, did everybody write down at least one? Okay, now what I would like to ask you to do is pass it to the person on your right. So we're not going to ask the person on the right to keep you accountable. But if you would like to ask the person on the right to keep you accountable, you are welcome to do that. All right, I'm going to bring you back now. And hopefully that act of at least sharing it out loud as you would with the other person will help you try to do it during the day. I'm going to share with you a couple ways that we as facilitators are going to try and do this today. And I'm going to ask for your help with it, because you'll see that number 11 is respect the agenda and trust the process. So in order for this day to be successful, we need everybody to respect the agenda and trust the process. So I'm going to introduce the facilitators, if you can raise your hand. Nicole Kennard, Ruthie Yao, who you've met, Anna Tinoco Santiago in the back, Chris Chatfield, Comas Haynes. So all of us are going to try to do our best to facilitate you today. And so for the Q&A, Ruthie and Nicole are going to be walking around with the mics, and we are going to try and ensure that we have diverse voices in the room. So not the same person and not the same type of people talking all the time. So sometimes that might mean that even if you have your hand up, that we still look for other people to call on. This is getting a lot of feedback. And now it's really loud. So that's one thing we're going to do. As facilitators, we may intervene to keep the conversation flowing and keep us on track. To ensure that we don't eat into the afternoon, because people did a lot of preparation for the afternoon, okay? So if we cut you off, it's not because we don't like you. It's not because we think that what you're saying is not interesting. It's because we have to move on. So we hope you'll take it in the spirit in which it's intended. And we have over here something called a parking lot. Raise your hand if you used a parking lot before, not to park, but in a meeting. Okay, so if we have to cut you off, we're going to ask you to, at a break, take a Sharpie that is on your table and go over and put your thought on that parking lot so that we can still save it as we do the key takeaways later on. It's in the room, and also we're going to write up a report on this, and we can then use those ideas as well when we write up the report. Okay, so that's another thing we'll do. Try to avoid jargon and acronyms. So I don't know, we learned from the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance this jargon dragon. So I'm going to teach all of it to you now. It's this great little thing. Can you all do this? Raise your hand up high with the jargon dragon. If anybody uses jargon that you don't understand, put your hand up really high, and one of the facilitators will interrupt and either say what the acronym or jargon is or ask this person who said it to explain what it is. But that's also on all of us to try to not use acronyms and jargon. Okay? I think that's it. So we are going to, thank you. And I'm ahead of time, which is very unusual. I'm going to ask Ruthie to come back up and lead us in the morning's Energy Stories activity.
I'll do it. Thank you. Hi again, y'all. We are going to have 9 wonderful stories, and I'm going to launch us right in. And your first speaker is Lauren Keeler.
I'm Lauren Keeler from Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. This is a photo of me in a bathroom at a conference using a breast pump. My son was 4 months old, and as a postdoc on a 1-year contract, I had to go back to work with my son when my son was 5 weeks old. This breast pump was attached to me day in and day out for months. I would literally plug my body into an electrical outlet, and by nothing short of alchemy, milk would come out. By plugging myself in, I was able to keep my job and feed my son. Energy in the form of electricity is often narrowly conceived as everything that happens behind the outlet. But this picture is about what we do with energy and why that matters so much.
Adia Shirazi, coming from New York City. Okay, yes, I've just asked, sorry. I was born and raised in Pakistan, the 8th most climate vulnerable country with the 2nd worst air quality in the world. Rolling blackouts, acute energy insecurity, chronic air and water pollution, political instability, heat waves, floods and droughts, and a population plunged into deep, multi-dimensional poverty were the backdrop of my entire childhood and teenage years in Karachi, which sits just behind New York as the 12th largest city in the world. I moved to New York City as a college freshman and was shocked to learn that even in the richest city in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, 1 in 3 households experience energy poverty, making choices between paying their energy bills or buying food or medication. Living in climate vulnerable communities on the front lines of climate change my entire life inspired me to work on inclusive climate mitigation and adaptation to accelerate global efforts for a truly just, clean energy transition for all, with a focus on the most vulnerable among us: youth, women, persons with disabilities, the elderly, and the displaced.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ramona Taylor Williams, and I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. As part of Mississippi Communities United for Prosperity, MCUP, decarbonization strategy, and 2 years of planning, we are launching Advancing Energy Equity in BIPOC Communities through Building Electrification, Healthy Housing, and Workforce Development. During phase 1 in June 2024, we will pilot our BIPOC Women's Transformative Workforce Development Program that is generously supported by the Solutions Project, ACEEE, and Collectrify, formerly the Equitable Building Electrification Fund. The model is designed to train 15 women ages 18 plus in the green building trades to create a pipeline of skilled workers to fill the workforce gap in the energy retrofitting and healthy housing space. B, increase the earning capacity of low-wage women earners, focusing on single heads of households. And C, reduce the energy burden of low to moderate income homeowners, particularly seniors. Our goal is to retrofit 150 low to moderate income homes over 5 years. The women will be certified to perform energy audits, lead assessments, and lead abatement and mitigation as well.
When I think about energy stories, I remember growing up in the wintertime, my mom would always put a pot of water on the stove, turn on the oven, and leave the oven door wide open as a source of heat to warm up our mobile home, making sure all of us were warm. We didn't want to run up the bill too high, so we'd also turn on portable heaters all around the house. And I always had the fear that we'd be playing around as kids and we'd knock over one of the portable heaters and our house would be engulfed in flames, thinking or not realizing that our house, was on fire until we saw smoke. The picture that you see here is one of my daughters, Ariana. She was about a month old. It's around Christmas time, and as you can see, she has a onesie, exposed her legs, and she's pretty warm. I smile looking at the photo, not only because it's a beautiful memory of my daughter being a baby, but also because I don't have to worry about my kids being, I don't have to worry if my kids are warm or not when we're at home. And every now and then as I lay in my warm bed, I feel grateful that I don't have to worry about my house catching on fire like I used to when I was a kid. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Solo, coming from Lithonia, Georgia. This piece titled Neon Nation is one of my more abstract pieces, influenced by my belief that the resources and abundance needed for individuals and communities to thrive are constantly present. They just require initiative to be accessed. And I, of course, welcome any interpretations you may have as well. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Amanda Simpson, and back when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, we had a project. Now I was down at what was Fort Rucker at the time, now it's Fort Novacell, and I was there to convince Command about an opportunity for an on-base solar array on a existing gray field that would, in regards to providing on-base energy resiliency. And I was told that as the principal helicopter training facility for the United States Army, that a solar array was incompatible with their mission because the reflection from the array was going to blind the pilots. And I pointed out that solar arrays are designed to absorb the light and reflect less than the nearby ponds and lakes. And with the abundance of solar arrays around the world, Army pilots really better get used to experiencing them prior to deployment anywhere else. And of course, that secured the final approval, and that is the 12 megawatt solar array that is down there in Alabama now.
Pegah Zamani, Iran, Middle East. Absence of energy. A flashback to the 8 years of Iran-Iraq war brings me childhood nights spent living, playing, and studying in the absence of electricity. My parents creatively brought us moments of comfort and lightened up our childhood despite the darkness of war. Each ray of light was cherished, bringing us a sense of hope, strength, and resilience. With thousands of people living in a war around the world, regrettably, this energy story holds no end.
Hello, my name is Ren Dillard, and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. This piece, While the World Burns, serves as a powerful visual metaphor for this innovative climate technology. Materials like copper used in the artwork are also used in direct air capture technology, creating a tangible connection between the viewer and the mechanisms behind this environmental solution. The piece depicts Black men magically transforming into Black birds. They seem to be enjoying inner city life while a huge mushroom cloud looms behind them in the distance. Metaphorically, wings often symbolize awakening as they represent the ability to rise above a previous state of being. Wings signify a character's awakening to new knowledge, freedom, or self-discovery. They can embody the liberation from constraints or the realization of one's potential, marking the beginning of a journey towards a higher state of consciousness. While the World Burns evokes a deeper contemplation on the relationship between humanity and the environment, by drawing parallels between the layered complexity of mixed media art and the multifaceted approach required to address climate change, the artwork can inspire a dialogue about the future of our planet and the proactive steps we must take to ensure its health.
Hello, my name is Jake Farrell. I come from Cincinnati via DC. A fresh chapter of my energy story is written every day when, upon waking, I slip 2 tiny computers behind my ears and turn on my hearing aids. A sing-song jingle lets me know that they have been fully charged through the night before my world becomes awash in sound. The birds outside my window, the AC kicking on, a housemate making breakfast in the kitchen. This has been my morning ritual, my regular reminder of the wonders of human technology ever since I was a child, and will likely remain my morning ritual until my last day. I live a cyborg existence. My everyday experience is enhanced by and made dependent on our ability as a society to keep the electricity reliable enough for me to get a charge. Excuse me. I recognize that I am privileged and that I have access to such abundant energy. I am reminded of this fact every time I go camping in the woods with my friends. It turns out there are very few electrical outlets in state parks. So when I go camping with my friends, we assemble together a legion of power banks designed to keep the energy flowing where it's needed. And I always leave feeling extra grateful for the good souls who are happy to make experiences like that accessible for me. Energy structures my life experience in quite a ubiquitous and intimate way, but I suppose my story is just one voice in an already deafening chorus calling for a more just and sustainable energy democracy, and may the chorus only grow louder. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, storytellers. That was so beautiful. I wanted to quickly point out the art in the room. You heard from Ren, and you heard from Shantae or Solo. I'd also like to ask quickly Sienna to stand up. Sienna's art is also in the room. Do you mind, Sienna? Thank you. Sienna, would you share the title of the piece?
Oh, okay. Wow. In that very moment, I forgot the title. But To Be Seen is the name.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, thank you, Sienna. You're great. You're great. Sienna specifically said, "No, I'm good. I don't need to talk." And then I made them talk. So please forgive me. If you all would like to, please do speak to the artists about their really wonderful work. We are lucky to have them here, and they are really lifting up the energy and the purpose of our day. I'm going to pass this mic with excitement to Dr. Stewart. We welcome you, Dr. Stewart. Uh-oh. Oh, this is just our little transition to Dr. Stewart's slides. Dr. Simone Stewart is with us as our keynote speaker. Remember, no bios, so Dr. Stewart's going to do right by herself. But I will tell you, she's the Senior Industrial Policy Specialist at the National Wildlife Federation. We're super lucky to have you, Simone. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. So as you were just told in that very brief introduction, My name is Simone Houston Stewart, and I am the Senior Industrial Policy Specialist on the Climate and Energy team at the National Wildlife Federation. I'd like to thank Georgia Tech and those at the Center for Sustainable Communities Research and Education, specifically Jenny Hirsch, and the Strategic Energy Institute for curating this event and for inviting me today to deliver the keynote for this very important conversation. I would also like to thank Jenny for working with my family who is in the room to coordinate them being able to come. So family wave to everybody. It's not often that your mother, your aunt, and your cousin get to watch you public speak. So, in order to begin this very important conversation, we must realize that we are facing a huge challenge as a global society: how to address the climate crisis to prevent the worst of impacts from harming and destabilizing society while ensuring that the most vulnerable are not left behind in the process. The crisis is already upon us. The last 4 years were the hottest on record. The sea level has risen due to the melting of glaciers and ice sheets. Food security has been impacted, with climate change resulting in soil degradation and worsening availability and quality of water, and higher frequency and intensity of weather events such as heat waves, droughts, and typhoons causing mass destruction. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a UN body of global scientists, has determined that we must limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius in order to prevent the worst of climate disasters, many of which are anticipated to be irreversible or long-lasting. The 0.5 degree difference between this gap may seem small, but reaching 2 degrees could mean some 420 million more people being frequently exposed to extreme heat waves, higher projections of heavy precipitation associated with tropical cyclones, increases in drought frequency and magnitude, and all of this overlapping with risks across food, water, and other resources, creating new and exacerbating current vulnerabilities worldwide. So knowing this, where do we go from here? For the past nearly 3 years at the National Wildlife Federation, I have led our industrial decarbonization work in response to the climate crisis. While there will not be a silver bullet that solves the crisis, and in fact, what is needed is a multi-pronged approach, the leading global scientists recognize there is a need for industrial decarbonization and the removal of legacy CO2 emissions. Based on this understanding, our work at NWF has a strong focus on the responsible deployment of carbon management strategies, both technological and hybrid, and including direct air capture, known as DAC. I will not take time here to define DAC, as Professor Ralph will be diving deeper into the technology, how it works, what role it might play in our larger response to the crisis, but for the purpose of my presentation, you should know this. There is an excess of CO2 in our atmosphere. It is overwhelming our oceans and plants that have naturally processed it for thousands of years because we are putting it there faster than they can remove it. Enter DAC, a technology that can remove that CO2 directly from the atmosphere and condense it to a concentrated state. In my work, I have helped to carve out a space for the National Wildlife Federation to join in the push for a green transition, specifically responsible carbon removal, a tricky part of our response to the climate crisis. At NWF, I've written briefs, educated NGO, government, and industry partners, and spoken about the intersections between environmental justice and the deployment of technological solutions. Prior to my work at NWF, I received my PhD in mechanical engineering at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I specialized in fluid mechanics, studying flow over rough surfaces with applications in DAC and wind turbine architecture. Additionally, for 2 of those 5 years spent at UCSB, I was a graduate assistant at the Blum Center for Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy, a position normally occupied by history, political science, or sociology graduate students. As an engineer eager to better understand the role of democracy in our society, I worked there on educational campaigns and covered topics from the Green New Deal to equitable responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is normally how I would introduce myself before giving a talk or speaking on a panel. I tell people what I do now, what background makes me qualified to present these topics, teaching the audience something hopefully that they don't already know. But I want you all to stick with me as I try something new today. My talk today is about the role of environmental justice in deploying DAC. More specifically, what I want to discuss with you today is about defining what responsible means when we say responsible carbon management or responsible deployment, and how centering environmental and climate justice can lead us to deciding the best framework for that. I recognize this is a very nuanced conversation given the history of misuses of technology by industry in ways that actually end up harming marginalized communities. That is why I want to use an environmental and climate justice framework to discuss the importance of responsibility for our conversation. So as we dive into this subject, I'd like to start by reintroducing myself, and in doing so, explaining who I am, what I'm doing here today, and hopefully chipping away at what we need to consider if we want our transition to be as just and equitable as we say we do. Given that, I'd like to start by clarifying a few things up front. 1, I do not represent a particular community or their views. 2, I don't purport to be an EJ expert or scholar, though my work is heavily focused on those intersections. 3, I recognize that my talk today may pose more questions than it gives answers. And lastly, 4, I'm about to get personal. So let's start with specific communities and their views. I've frequently been asked to speak about what communities think about DAC and the surrounding infrastructure when it comes to industrial decarbonization and deploying technology to meet climate goals. Early in my career at NWF, I made a name for myself for speaking on panels, raising my hands at workshops, chatting with other, mainly people of color, about community considerations when it comes to deploying technological solutions. I was frequently in these rooms with policy specialists like myself, industry representatives, sometimes academics, but rarely folks that most of us would qualify as community members. To be clear, I didn't raise these questions because I was representing a particular community, but because my life has been a string of reminders that closed mouths don't get fed. I never purported to be a community member in any of these settings, just like I don't now. I'm proud of my NWF title and the skill set I've curated over many years to make me qualified to hold the position. Often when it comes to these delineations, I wonder what community means. Where are the boundaries of it? I, like everyone here, am a member of many different communities, physical communities, those based on identity, and the even larger global community. But geography in the context of DAC is especially important. So it is a fact that I was raised across the US, Ohio, Texas, Missouri. And in each place, I lived a relatively upper middle class lifestyle thanks to the work and perseverance of my parents and my privileged circumstances compared to many who look like me. I never wondered if my water was clean. We lived within 3 miles of a grocery store where I had access to fresh fruits and vegetables. I had yards to play in, green spaces to enjoy, and clean air to breathe. If the promise of a DAC facility or any of its supporting infrastructure had been brought to the hyperlocal communities of which I was a part, they would not have been approaching those who are most likely to see their communities as in need of environmental justice. My view of a new project would not have been influenced by a legacy of toxic pollution filling my air, chemicals leaching into my groundwater, or general concerns for my safety or the further entrenchment of harmful infrastructure. Almost 2 years ago, I participated in a small meeting with environmental justice leaders, industry professionals, and NGO advocates around the carbon removal industry. Our facilitator, a talented woman with a background in human rights law, told us the analogy of the wooden spoon. I thought it was so powerful that I continue to repeat it whenever I discuss DAC. The analogy is this: when presented with a wooden spoon, what immediately comes to mind? I'll give you a chance to think for a moment. Some might say the wooden spoon. Some might say the wooden spoon reminds them of their childhood, cooking in the kitchen with their grandmother. Some might say it reminds them of how their grandmother beat them when they misbehaved. That it was her preferred choice of punishment instrument. The point was, we might all be looking at the same object, but with us, we carry our own experiences, perspectives, and histories. No one starts from a blank slate, but instead we navigate the world using the information we have. While my lived experience differs in a lot of ways from those in urban overburdened communities, there is one thing I have come to find I have in common. It's the fact that two things can be true at once, and that people, while holding space for both of them, should still be allowed to feel strong emotions and seek pathways to change. This is a fact that often resonates when I hear from local people about how frustrated they are with toxic infrastructure near their homes, while also recognizing that the economic presence of many of these industries provides jobs necessary for survival. It is something that I think many BIPOC communities have come to terms with as they navigate oppressive systems. For me, one of those paradoxes is that despite growing up in a traditional two-parent household with comfortable incomes in communities with plenty of resources, as a Black woman moving through a white male world, I was still persecuted by the institutions I had to navigate. At the same time, I was also often required to demonstrate my competence and worthiness when the same was not asked of my non-Black peers. And in many rooms within those institutions, I'm asked to play the role of a race representative, to plead the case of people who look like me. This begs the question, am I invited into these spaces because of my earned credentials or my demographic makeup? Perhaps it is both, and that I have a scientific credential while also having a socially and politically useful identity. Regardless, this is a question in which many of my positions people are forced to grapple. This brings me to my next point. I am told, or it is implied with relative frequency, that I am not an environmental justice scholar or activist. It is true that I didn't formally study environmental justice. I was offered no certification, and I've already made clear that I do not come from what might be defined as an environmental justice community. That said, and considering the discussions I'm party to, the invitations I get, I seek ways to create space for others who might be better equipped to stand at the lectern. However, as a Black woman in the US and even more broadly in the world, I identify with a passage from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he states, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." So despite my background and because of my social identity, I am not perceived as separate from Black people who are living in EJ communities. Circumstances require me to consider environmental justice because growing up across the Midwest and the South with an adopted sister from South Africa, having seen the richest countries and the poorest, it is impossible for me not to. I bring up EJ scholarship because I think it is important to mention here that many environmental justice activists, experts, and communities see DAC and the larger push for carbon removal and industrial decarbonization as antithetical to the phrase itself. This is where we often encounter the false solution rebuttals. The Climate Justice Alliance, an EJ organization, defines the themes around what constitutes a false solution as continually extractive, leading to ongoing concentration of political or economic power, and/or will continue poisoning or displacing certain communities while reducing the climate crisis to a solely carbon-based focus. And while the term may be triggering for some of the DAC advocates in the room, myself included, I'll remind you of the analogy of the wooden spoon. In this context, the concept of a false solution should make sense given who are most climate vulnerable. Some see it as a tool to accomplish good, and others see it as a tool that could inflict harm. And yes, both can be true at the same time. Certain categories, low socioeconomic status, BIPOC, women and girls, and those over the age of 65, are often found in the same communities that have the categories of burden that make them environmental justice communities, including economic disinvestment, energy, water, health, housing, and legacy pollution. So what can we do to make sure that DAC is deployed in the US and abroad in ways that avoid becoming exactly what people are already afraid it is, a false solution? Well, to start, I think we should go back to the definition of environmental justice. While there is no singular definition of environmental justice, I think in all my work and research, the quote from the late Dr. Bunyan Bryant, an EJ pioneer, is the most holistic and prescriptive. He says environmental justice refers to those cultural norms, values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions that support sustainable communities where people can interact with confidence that the environment is safe, nurturing, and productive. Environmental justice is served when people can realize their highest potential, where both cultural and biological diversity are respected and highly revered, and where distributive justice prevails. I like this definition the most because I find it to be a clear, direct response to prevent false solutions. Dr. Bryant builds the image of a collective where the highest potential of everyone is reached. I think it is important to remind everyone that while environmental justice is a movement and a practice, it is also a goal towards which we should strive. So how do we get there? Now here comes the big ideas and posing more questions than answers. In preparation for this keynote, I was talking with Professor Ralph, who will follow my talk with an overview of DAC and the climate task at hand. During our conversation, he mentioned having read the book Catastrophe Ethics: How to Choose Well in a World of Tough Choices. The book, written by a bioethicist, works to build catastrophe ethics, which at their core acknowledge the terrifying time in which we exist, where we are faced with the reality that individual action, like choosing not to use a plastic straw or water bottle, does little to correct our catastrophic trajectory in the face of massive corporations and media. What does it mean to grapple with the fact that when it comes to the climate crisis, at least, we as individuals live in a state of disenfranchisement? More now than ever, it seems, we wonder how much the individual can impact the whole, especially in such a globalized world. Is it possible for the actions of someone in the global north to directly impact the global south? How, in the face of this disenfranchisement, do we empower and save ourselves? Undoubtedly, there is one thing we do know, that for the betterment of society, in response to the climate crisis, and in the face of DAC deployment, we must work towards a collective democracy and collective liberation, one that does not rest on another group's subjugation. That is how Dr. Bryant's vision for environmental justice and climate justice becomes a reality. Earlier this year, I was invited to participate in a greenhouse gas removal workshop hosted by a climate funder. And while I won't name them, I will say the funder has literally trillions of dollars of personal net worth to inject into the space. At the beginning of the presentation, setting the stage, they offered up a comparison. In order to address the climate crisis globally, greenhouse gas removal must climb to the gigaton scale. And the only other sectors that have managed to do this are the fossil and some raw materials industries like cement. What seemed totally lost on the funders and the majority tech startup, finance, and economic audience was this frightening insinuation. DAC has to be just like gigaton sectors that have come before it in order to meet our goals. Yet there was no recognition of the harm these industries perpetuated in their growth, the destabilization of democracies, the land grabs, the displacement, and frankly, the bloodshed. The irony is that if you were to talk to any community member worried about what it might look like for carbon removal infrastructure to be deployed, they would likely state the same dangerous outcomes, not deliverance. So how do we ensure that DAC is different in deployment and operation than its gigaton scale predecessors? If DAC is deployed in a capitalist system, despite the best intentions of democratizing the process, the pull of profit could still reinforce a system that historically disenfranchises us and limits our futures. So how can things be different? Well, in the US, we have started to take steps like the community benefits plans required as a part of applications to the Department of Energy's covered programs in response to the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative. You might have also heard about some of the following strategies. Social life cycle analyses where self-defined benefits are weighed with environmental impacts as determined by importance to the community. Co-designing and implementing alternative ownership frameworks based on practices like ABCD, asset-based community development, starting with what the community has rather than what it lacks. Implementing frameworks already designed and practiced by Indigenous communities for hundreds of years. A targeted shift to include not just carrots, but also sticks in our legislation, demanding policy like carbon prices, carbon border adjustments, and polluter taxes in response to the history and lived experience of the most disenfranchised. While it would behoove us to better shape deployment using these strategies, it begs the question about if and how we are addressing historic power dynamics. Does the incorporation of these approaches matter if when the spending is done, the funding and benefits are not truly dispersed to the communities that need them most and the historic playing field remains unlevel? If the individual, whether that manifests as a singular person or private business, is put above the collective identity? In confronting our own US-based deployment challenges, we must grapple with another issue: the global need for carbon removal and the balance of localized environmental justice concerns with climate justice and accountability. This is perhaps one of the most difficult parts of the movement to reconcile. That deploying DAC at scale in the US may bring limited local or immediate benefits, but simultaneously will address the responsibility of the global north to clean up its pollution that has left the global south vulnerable to the climate crisis. In this context, I have heard DAC referred to as the great equalizer or a tool for climate reparations. But I have to ask, how is this possible when we have not yet even reconciled with that which we need to equalize, that which we need to repair? How can this be true when in nearly every conversation about DAC deployment, I've heard Europeans tell me the EU doesn't have to consider environmental justice like the US, as if implying we are utopian societies rather than the truth, that many of the externalities of our decisions live off continent and are felt in the global south, from Congo to India. How can we have climate reparations when we have not even asked what DAC could mean for democracy, for resources, for women and girls tasked with walking hours to bring water back to their kin? If we have not seen the ways in which the world has been destabilized, if we cannot even begin to call out the systems that marginalize people, from redlining in the Gulf South to apartheid in Gaza, then how can we even truly begin to envision a future in which DAC can benefit vulnerable populations? And even if we do come to terms with these topics, What does any of it mean in the face of inequitable distribution of economic power, the fundamental feature of capitalism? At its core, I think we must strive to reframe our thinking about how we deploy a climate solutions portfolio, including DAC, as a Western nation with a responsibility to the most vulnerable in both the US and abroad. If we want to think about deploying DAC responsibly, then we must also confront the circumstances in which we are deploying DAC, capitalistic and without hard metrics to evaluate impacts, lacking accountability. We have to admit our current system, which relies on prioritizing the economically efficient in order to get the best return on investment, is not designed for the success of the collective, especially when that collective includes the most disadvantaged among us. Thinking only of the least cost solutions can result in any number of the following scenarios. Guaranteeing the first considerations for siting end up being the land that is most affordable, easiest to buy, and is frequently occupied by or near people who cannot afford to leave. Insufficient supporting systems like underdeveloped dispersion models in the case of Denbury's pipelines in Satartia. Lack of emergency response plans, funding, and prioritization when it comes to communities that have not been important enough to warrant the investment and coordination full-scale plans might take. And using the justification that such measures are necessary to save disadvantaged households and communities as an excuse to bypass legitimate concerns of those who have profited and benefited the least from our current system. A truly radical framework would perhaps be one that utilizes the lens of history to hold pollutive systems and actors accountable by not just creating funding mechanisms that rely on their repayment, but citing facilities where they make geologic and infrastructural sense, and near those who have profited the most from the highest CO2 emissive activities and those most likely to profit from DAC. Might this be the way to ensure that DAC and its entire ecosystem is deployed with the same robust care and protection of any other infrastructure in these geographies? In considering our future, I suggest we approach DAC not just as a tool to address legacy emissions and lower warming, but rather as a means to hold responsible parties accountable, ensuring that those who have historically benefited from polluting activities share a proportionate burden of the cost and implications of the damage control, while expanding our hopes and vision for DAC to include pathways that set us up for repair, restoration, and accessible democracy. This framing should not just outline the parameters through which we practice DAC responsibly, but also serve as an outcome to which we strive. If given the right role and the right guardrails, might DAC be a tool for the collective to achieve the enfranchisement we so lack as individuals? While preparing for this talk, I was inspired by a mentor who is also a colleague of mine, as I reflected on a talk he gave last year where he used a picture of his daughter in a presentation about DAC to largely industry and policy-based audience. Similarly, today, I've chosen to insert myself into the narrative. As you can see, a picture of me with both of my parents and a picture of me when I graduated from UCSB. Not only that, but this is a reclamation of sorts given the role of Georgia Tech in advancing the DAC sector through its research and preparation of future engineers and scientists, and my PhD experience in mechanical engineering and those of my BIPOC peers in STEM academia. I feel this is necessary given how academic structures typically fail us, forcing us to leave our identities at the doorsteps of our labs rather than carrying our whole selves across the threshold. So I hope that in my endeavor to be vulnerable with you, that you all will come authentically and vulnerably to the rest of this symposium. I started my engineering journey in junior high school in a predominantly white, predominantly male introductory course on engineering design. We learned to draw three-dimensional structures, the basics of CAD and engineering design software for those of you unfamiliar with its wonders, and how to reverse engineer projects to better understand how they work. My parents realized early on that in this course I was thriving, that it allowed the creative side of my mind to blossom and that I welcomed all of its challenges and excitement. That suddenly my world was even more open than it had been previously. They realized there was space for me there to design, to dream. What more could parents hope for? On a parent-teacher night, where we got to present to the class and our families on the engineering design of a particular object, my supportive teacher asked me at the end of my talk if I liked engineering and if I knew what I wanted to do as a career. The answer was obvious to me. I said I would be an engineer when I grow up. And much to the chagrin of my mother and father, who watched me stand proudly, a mother in the crowd asked loudly, "Honey, why would you be an engineer when you can just marry one?" My mother remembers this moment. While likely shocking for some, this element of being alien, not welcome in engineering spaces cropped up throughout my career. My white male peers were congratulated by physics alumni at college events, while I was rarely spoken to. When I entered UC Santa Barbara to start my mechanical engineering PhD in 2016, I was the only Black graduate in the entire College of Engineering, 4 departments. To this day, it is possible I might be the first Black woman to ever graduate with the title, but as there were so few Black PhDs recorded before me, we will never know for sure. Barely 2 years into that program, I was told by my advisor that I should probably take the opportunity to master out, that there was no shame in not finishing, that there were even astronauts with master's degrees, and that not everyone got to build the rocket ship, but someone in fact had to order the screws that held it together. It was like I was 13 again. Again, there was a sense of other, of stepping into a space and being told, you do not belong here. It was not made for people like you. So if this was my story in 2016, how can we expect our students to shift the boundaries of power and society when we maintain archaic ones in the halls of academia? How do we expect our students to break down barriers to climate and sustainability questions when we can hire Black faculty but not retain them, when we can admit Latinx students but not see them flourish, when we can prop ourselves up as accessible institutions but students with disabilities have fewer resources to complete their coursework, when we can promote women to positions of power and then maintain the same abusive dynamics obscured by pink rebranding? If we cannot dream to shift the power dynamics of academia and the leaky pipelines which remain leaky because of the holes poked in it by racism, classism, and sexism, if we are to uphold what I was once told was a sacred relationship between graduate student and advisor, then how can we dream to shift the power dynamics of the world? At the Department of Energy, at the EPA, the dynamics between industries and the communities in which they operate, the struggle of power between elected officials and resource-scarce communities they claim to represent. When we cannot even create engineers that dream outside of the box of capitalism, how can we have goals to shift global supply chains and transition the rest of society, much less do so justly? What do we owe the communities who dream of a better future? Well, we owe them space to dream, to learn, to teach, to create, to own, to self-determine. We owe them an effort to create pathways to be involved, whether it's jobs that don't require a choice between health and money, PhDs that come without the trauma of being the first, the onlys, the shoulda mastered outs, apprenticeships that teach valuable skills and put them to use, positions on the boards and leadership committees, more than just the promise of global climate stability, something closer to the vision of Dr. Bryant's. We owe a lot of work to break down capitalist structures and build durable and thoughtful policies. We owe them confrontation of what these entwined systems of oppression have done and what we will do to get the world back on track, to provide clean resources, healthy and accessible outdoor spaces, thriving wildlife and ecosystems, not just thinking about the US, but globally, because our liberation is interconnected and none of us are free until all of us are free. I've spoken a lot about the what needs to be done, what needs to be prevented. And I know it's not as easy as snapping your fingers and drawing 3D objects like I did in my intro to engineering design class. But that is what gatherings like this are for. Each time we gather, we have an opportunity to dream, to envision, and then to do the work. Audre Lorde wrote in a paper about her Blackness, her womanness, her queerness, and the self-revelatory act of transforming silence into language and action, because you're never really a whole person if you remain silent. In this reflection, she writes, "For to survive in the mouth of the dragon we call America, we have had to learn this first and most vital lesson, that we were never meant to survive, not as human beings, and neither were most of you here today, Black or not, and that visibility, which makes us the most vulnerable, is that which is also our source of our greatest strength." I think this applies to more than just the US, but people across the globe trying to survive in the global systems which shackle us. In response to this quote, author Cole Arthur Riley said, "They want us to waste our days, plucking teeth one by one from the mouth of the dragon. But as Audre Lorde reminds us, we must learn to envision life outside of the teeth of the dragon altogether. We deserve more than survival. We protect our dreaming." So for those of us here, whether for communities, for DAC, for climate, or all of the above, let us keep dreaming and let us start doing. Thank you. Thank you all for that. I see my mother tearing up back there.
Dr. Stewart, are you willing to take some questions?
Yes, of course.
Wonderful, thank you. Shoot your hand up and we'll come to you.
Thank you.
Oh, you are just such a, I can't even hardly speak.
Thank you.
I work with youth, right, in rural Mississippi, and also now in Jackson. And we have a girls initiative, and we created a hybrid STEM program because when we first interviewed the youth for our Youth Leadership Institute, we asked them all, what would they want if they could be anything today in this moment, what would they want to be? And unanimously, they all said smart. So we created a STEM program called SMART for science, math, art, reading, and technology.
That's great.
And since 2018, we have graduated 15 of our youth. We have a group that's graduating. 7 of them are graduated with honors. And 4 of our girls are going into science, earth science, engineering, and those kind of things. I would just love for you to meet them.
I mean, it's
because you are.
They
just,
sound wonderful. I would.
And I know
meet them.
Mustafa. He's like my son,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So
Mustafa Santiago Ali is our VP of Environmental Justice at the National Wildlife Federation.
So I would just love for our girls to have the opportunity, even if it's a virtual meeting, for you to speak to them and encourage them and all of our children, because it is just so important for them to have role models and them to have examples to model their life after and look up to that look like them. Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
Mom, thank you so much for giving us this gift.
Yes.
Dr. Stewart, you absolutely crushed that. That was incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you for starting us off this way. So I took some notes about something you were saying about higher education, and it really got me thinking, like, you can recruit people of color, but you can't get them to stay. And then I connected that back to something you were saying about environments need to be safe, nurturing, productive. Why aren't we seeing that in higher education? What can we do about that?
Yeah, wow. I've spent many a night lying awake thinking about that. As you all can glean, I had a very tumultuous PhD experience. My advisor and I still don't talk to this day. I think we were both glad when I left. And I was glad that I didn't have to, hold my mother back from throttling him so I could get my degree. I think that this is my personal kind of perspective, not speaking as NWF, but I think that academia needs just a complete overhaul in so many ways. I was told by a professor who's a dean of engineering, actually, she was the one that said that the relationship between graduate student and professor is sacred and you don't want to do anything to taint that. She was speaking specifically in the context of graduates unionizing because they were on strike. And I think that this perspective of it comes back to other things I said in the speech, that it's a power dynamic that we have to question. And things like tenure have, created the power dynamic where those who can reach a certain threshold are untouchable. And to them, graduate students are kind of expendable labor. That's evidence in the fact that I was paid like minimum wage during my 5 years in graduate school. I got the job at the Blum Center also because I needed another job. I was living in Santa Barbara, which is one of the most expensive counties in California. I was 10 minutes away from Oprah and Ellen, and I had 4 roommates the whole time I lived there in graduate school because I couldn't afford to live by myself. So I think that academia needs an overhaul. I think that that overhaul has to be led by the people that are in the most vulnerable positions. One of the things that I heard from a lot of my Black female STEM peers was that they wanted to become faculty, but they knew that they would have to do twice as much work as other white male faculty, because when students that are undergrads feel disenfranchised at the university, they look for role models. They look for people who look like them. So if I were to become Black faculty, I'm also probably going to be the chairperson of clubs for the undergrads. I'm probably going to be trying to do more to get more Black graduate students to join the programs. And does any of that appear in a tenure application? No, it's about how many papers you publish. It's about how much revenue you bring to the university. All of these things that cannot be graded in the way that we typically look at moving to that next level are the things that people in vulnerable positions are doing to create safe and nurturing spaces in academia so more people who look like them will join. So what that overhaul looks like and in the US system and on what timeline, I'm not sure that I could figure that out at the lectern here, but I think definitely that getting younger people in academic spaces has been important. My advisor was not even 40 years old. So a lot of people think, oh, he must have been an old white guy to say things like that. His son was in kindergarten. He was maybe 38. And so it's not just about youth, but it is about encouraging younger folks that haven't worked in academia to go in and change the experiences that they've had. Because I know that it was the Black students and the women in STEM that had these horrible experiences that were the most committed to making sure that they never happened again. And so I think that those are the people who really need to be leading the charge with the way that we kind of break this very, supposed meritocracy down, so academia can be a more welcoming place for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I listen and I learned.
Thank you.
You touched me, and my question is, could you please amplify the traditional power, shifting the traditional power dynamics? Mm-hmm. Because that is underlying all that we're trying to do. So could you listed some points. Can you amplify that from your lived experiences and what you see in academia?
Yeah, so I think that academia was one of the first times that I had encountered the power dynamics. I was a physics undergraduate, and I was maybe one of the first Black physics graduates. When I was in undergrad, I was maybe one of 4 girls that were graduated with physics degrees. And I noticed even from the very beginning of that time, I was so proud to be a physics graduate student. I was learning the coolest stuff in the world, and I wanted to share it with everyone. And we would have these amazing alumni events at houses like this. And the physics grads, alumni would come back and they would shake all the hands of the guys. And then they would look at the girls and kind of be like, could you go get me a cookie or some juice or something like that? And I was like, I'm learning physics too. Shake my hand. And so I think it was kind of, that was kind of the first time I really experienced this power dynamic in academia. And I had to be nice because these people were donors and they gave money back and they built the observatory. So you kind of learn how to bite your tongue. And it's exactly like Audre Lorde said, it's like you learn how to pick the teeth in the mouth of the dragon. And I think it was because I had good examples. I had good undergrad faculty. I had a supportive system at home. I had supportive, friends that when you're in the trenches with each other, you become each other's support, that helped me envision that life outside of the mouth of the dragon. And then I went back in the mouth of the dragon again and went to graduate school, where I experienced a completely new power dynamic. I had never been in a structure where the word of one person could ruin your life, essentially, to be completely frank. And I'd seen many lives ruined, and they held them up as a threat and said, you don't want to be like them, do you? You're going to do this. You want that paper published, don't you? You want to speak at that conference, don't you? So you're going to do all of these things. And so it was a really toxic power structure. And that's not to say that academia in itself is toxic and that every professor, tenured professor, every white male professor is like that. But I think that we have to start speaking up about these things. We have to start challenging them. When I graduated was when I finally had the courage to talk about what had happened. And I wrote a letter to my university. It was 10 pages long. And I had specific instances. I had dates, times, places, quotes. And they sent it to the Title IX office. And the Title IX office reviewed and said, we don't see a case here. Doesn't look like a case for abuse. So I said, well, you should keep it on file in case anybody that looks like me comes back to you and says the same things about this guy, because I guarantee you they will. And they haven't, because nobody else has joined his group that is a BIPOC or a woman, because word gets around for graduate students. So I think that, it was one of those examples of these toxic power dynamics that are a parallel. I was frequently told in school that academia is a microcosm of the real world, sort of thing. And the power structures are the exact thing. They are a microcosm of the real world power structures. The disenfranchisement I felt as a student is the disenfranchisement that folks in vulnerable communities feel, that folks in the global South feel, that inability to act, the fear of raising your hand and calling out the power structure, because you'll be punished. You'll be like the people who've been punished before you. We started with a land acknowledgement and with a civil rights acknowledgement. And I think the history of environmental justice and some of its tension with climate justice goes back to the fact that environmental justice really spurred out of the civil rights movement. It has a very distinct US context, as opposed to climate justice, which has a more global lens about how the US interacts with the rest of the world. And so I think that it's important to consider that this fight for environmental justice is a part of a larger web of a fight for justice holistically. I tell people frequently in industries that have a lot of power, have a lot of money, NGOs and political and the folks on Capitol Hill, you can't cherry pick environmental justice. It doesn't work like that to say, I work in the climate sector, I'm going to work on environmental justice. Environmental justice is connected to public health, public education. It's connected to resources. It's connected to energy burdens and energy justice. It's connected to the military industrial complex. It's connected to the incarceral complex that we have in the United States. One of my mentors, David Pello from UCSB, wrote a paper about the intersections between the prison industrial complex and climate in the United States. So to say that environmental justice is this one aspect that I'm going to do because I care about DAC and separate it from the other social movements that have to happen to move us as a world, to move us as a country towards liberation, is, I think, naive. And you can't do one without it being a part of this larger whole. So in order to strive for environmental justice in the deployment of DAC and the deployment of renewables, any of these other climate technologies, you have to recognize that they are interconnected to this larger web of striving for justice as a society as a whole. I'm also not keeping time, so I'm hoping, okay.
Thank you. And thank you for everything you're sharing with us today. So in my knowledge in the past, NWF hasn't been that diverse. Really happy to see you there. We love Mustafa. We've got a group of Mustafa supporters here as well. How is your presence and that of him being there now, how is that assisting you or assisting them in truly understanding the environmental justice issues? How do you feel like your role there has influenced?
Yeah, that's a great question. So NWF is historically a conservation-based organization. We're about 80 years old, and the climate team and the environmental justice team are relatively new. Climate team is only about a decade old. So in an 80-year history, that's relatively new. And so with Mustafa Santiago Ali, our Exec VP of Environmental Justice, we've really had this kind of ushering of environmental justice into the core principles and strategies of how NWF functions. And it really started when him and our CEO, Colin O'Mara, had a conversation really about recognizing, and part of what I discuss in the speech is coming to terms with what the structures look like that we're in now. Colin basically said exactly what you said. The conservation movement has been historically white. It's been historically male. When we think conservation, we think Teddy Roosevelt a lot of the time, and not, our indigenous brothers and sisters who are conserving the environment far before, any Europeans came to America. And so it was this recognition that we have to do better as an organization, that these things are inextricably intertwined and that conservation belongs to everyone. So it was really an overhaul that the organization went through. They hired consultants, they brought people in for trainings, and they said, we're going to be an organization that embeds environmental justice at its core. And it's only been a few years since we've started doing it, so I still think that there are, road bumps and things that we have to work out, but we've had great leadership that has really thought and strategized around how to incorporate this as a pillar of our work. One of the reasons that I appreciate NWF, and partially why I came to work at NWF, was because environmental justice was this lens through which they were saying everybody needs to be able to do their work. So as a person who does industrial policy, environmental justice is a lens, a pair of glasses that I should be looking through as I do my work, even though I'm an engineer. And that interdisciplinary worldview was really exactly what I had been searching for in academia, and why I took that role at the Blum Center at UCSB was because I fundamentally believe that this is how we should be doing any kind of work, whether in academia or in the public sector. And so I think that my role has been really interesting because the environmental justice work had been very grassroots at NWF. It had been a lot of us at the federal level working with grassroots groups and supplying them with funding and resources, helping them access grants and things like that. And now we're working on having a more federal policy-based approach. And I think, you know, one of the things that I have to be completely honest about is that there's tensions sometimes because of exactly what I said. I walk into certain rooms, and amongst environmental justice experts, I'm just an engineer. And so there is this question of, you know, who are you to speak on these issues? So I think that, you know, this is why I speak at these types of events, because I want to bridge that tension and bridge that gap, that to prove that this is work, to prove to students, to prove to faculty that if I can stand here as a mechanical engineer talking about liberation, quoting Audre Lorde, quoting Dr. King, then any engineer should be able to do that. And it should be a part of how they do their work. That worldview should be incorporated. And so I think NWF is really starting to think about how we do it. Our 3 pillars for our strategic plan, which we're in the process of editing, are environmental justice, climate, and conservation. So I think that that's another example that I'll kind of end on with that question, that it has to be truly and holistically incorporated. It can't be like the whipped cream and the cherry on top. It has to be one of the scoops of the ice cream, right? You know, for whatever analogy that is. And so it has to be one of the core pillars of the organization, and everybody has to understand its role. So I think that we're still trying to work out practically what that looks like, because we have an environmental justice department and team that is run by Dr. Adrienne Hollis. And so she heads that team. And so she has, you know, her own responsibilities and her own day-to-day, but then how are we merging that shared vision throughout the organization across our strategic frameworks is still something that we're working on, that I have hope for in the future, because I think it's one of the things that makes NWF such an outstanding organization, and an organization that really cares to try to do things right, because they took a hard look in the mirror and said, we're not who we want to be, and how do we get there?
Thank you so much. Just to ditto the crushing it. I'm an urban planner, and I find that a lot of the times when I'm working with engineers and the public, I have to be the translator.
Yes.
Right? And so you so wonderfully are able to both be an engineer and good at communicating. No offense to the engineers here, but how do we get more folks like you that can do that? Because one of the biggest issues is that I find in the work that I do is, even if the engineer knows what's going on, is able to understand the right thing, it's often that they are not able to effectively communicate that to others. I can't tell you how many times I'm at conferences and I go, I have no idea what they just said. They just showed a chart. I don't know what that means. The jargon, I mean, it's you know, and it's so difficult, because if we do have people that want to do the right thing and know what to do, but they can't effectively communicate that, then, you know, sort of what's the point? So do you have any recommendations for, you know, whether it's students going through academia or even folks that don't stay in academia, but go in to the real world, if you will? How do we actually effectively teach engineers how to communicate this to non-engineers?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you know, I totally understand the sentiment. What my undergrad physics advisor used to say, you know how an engineer is social? He looks at your shoes when he talks to you. Yeah, so I use that joke a lot. No, it's true. And you know, firstly, for my experience, it would be remiss of me once again not to shout out my mother, who has a background in PR and comms and was a television anchor for several years. So I grew up with that in the house. It was like read your essay out loud kind of thing. And I was on the debate team because she was like, you know, encouraged me to do it. We realized that sports weren't really my thing. So she was like, yeah, you know, do the debate team. So she really encouraged me to do those types of speaking engagements where I would have to get up in front of people in public space speak. I mean, putting me on the spot for like Thanksgiving prayer, like that kind of thing. But I think that in all seriousness, I think it's part of that overhaul in academia that I was talking about, that I think that there have to be a lot more communication courses. And I think that we have to break this stigma in STEM academia that like that is somehow lesser than, that the humanities or people who want to be anthropologists are somehow, not as smart as we are as physicists and scientists. Because even in graduate school, when I actually took a course on science communication, and I was so excited to take it. It was taught by an engineer who lectured and other things. And my advisor was like, that's a waste of a class. You should be taking, you guys are really going to like write my advisor letters after this. Yeah, I'll write it down for you. Don't worry. People are like, if you want to keep his anonymity, and I'm like, absolutely not. But it was hard because I was going against my advisor to take that class. So if I had an advisor that encouraged it, he said, this is a mandate. All of my students, everybody in my lab takes this course every year. If he had taught it, if he had approached me like that, I would have taken it with excitement instead of like trying to keep it under wraps that I had to take this class.